So, for example, the early Judean ministry of Christ, the launching event is really his baptism by John. The ending event is the imprisonment of John the Baptist. Seems to be create something of a transition in the heart of our Lord. And then the Great Galilean, the starting event, so to speak, is a trip through Samaria as he goes to Galilee. The ending event of that is the death of John the Baptist. And again, that triggers a transition in the heart of our Lord. He attempts to a more private ministry around Galilee, in and around Galilee, and that leads to the feeding of the 5,000. And then toward the end of that time period, he sets his face toward Jerusalem. And you got the later Judean ministry of our Lord as he goes back to the area of Judea again, which of course Jerusalem is the capital of that area. And the Feast of Booths is the beginning. Feast of Dedication about 3 months later is the end of that. And then he heads back to the area of Perea, across the Jordan where John ministered and baptized. He's there for about 3.5 months in Perea, in and out, various final stops, travels on his itinerary. And then as he turns his face toward Jerusalem, he comes up from Jericho and on his way to Jerusalem, and that's where you have Zacchaeus, and then of course his Passion Week and his resurrection and ascension. Okay, so here's what I'd like us to, let's go to Matthew and see if you can spot the seams in the book of Matthew as Matthew goes from phase to phase. Okay, now Matthew may not mention every phase, but he is going to refer to some of them. So where would you say is the first seam? Like, where does Jesus' early Judean ministry begin? Maybe you could just put like a verse reference in the chat. Where would you say the beginning of, if we follow this chart, so your initial event is what would launch the early Judean? Where would you say is in Matthew, where would be the beginning of Jesus' early Judean ministry? First Matthew, you've got first chapter's genealogy. Second chapter relates to events surrounding his birth. What do you think? Anybody have a verse reference? Okay, good. All right, very good. So Matthew 3:13, you can see Jesus is coming from Galilee. So he's coming essentially from home, I guess. And he comes to Jordan unto John to be baptized. And that's where you have his baptism. And so that launches what we would call the early Judean phase of Jesus' ministry. Where would you then have the start of his great Galilean ministry? Where would be the next seam? And you find a verse that, like the ending event of the early Judean ministry, and a suggestion that he is headed for Galilee. Or it'd be the next seam. Okay, we got a 4:12. Okay, good. Okay, you can see now when Jesus had heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee. And so this is your transition toward his great Galilean ministry. And if you want to think of it this way, between chapter 4, verse 11, and chapter 4, verse 12 of Matthew, this is where you have like Nicodemus. You have the miracle of the wedding of Cana. You've got the first cleansing of the temple. All of that, so to speak, is between chapter 4, verse 11 and chapter 4, verse 12. And Matthew doesn't record that. He just records a couple of events, basically the baptism and the temptation, That's all he essentially records of the early Judean. Then he jumps right to the great Galilean ministry of our Lord, which is what the Synoptic Gospels primarily do. Okay, what about, where would we find the next seam in the book, where there's a transition to the next phase? Okay, so starting in chapter 4, verse 12, as we page through, okay, all of this is the Galilean ministry of Christ. You've got the Sermon on the Mount. You've got chapters 8 and 9, which are talk about the different miracles. Where do we see the next seam, where you've got maybe a reference to the death of John the Baptist and something that suggests a shift to a more private ministry, or a ministry in and around, maybe a more of an isolated place? Anybody find the next seam? Have to go a few chapters. The synoptics do give a good deal of space to the great Galilean ministry, which is why we're very familiar typically with the miracles in the great Galilean ministry. Anybody? Okay. All right. Well, it's good to hear from Joyce Young. She's doing a great job. Yeah. So 14, 15. You've got, and you can see, like, even in the verses before, earlier in chapter 14 of Matthew, this is the story of the death of John the Baptist. So if you can see, the ending event of the great Galilean was the death of John the Baptist. And again, that somehow that triggered some kind of a transition. And then verse 15, or actually let's see, we go back to verse 13. When Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart. And I would probably vote for chapter 14, 13. But again, 13 to 15, you're right. We're right in that area. But he departs into a desert place. So you've got the death of John the Baptist. That incident recorded. Jesus says, okay, so for some reason, okay, it's time to a little more private ministry with my disciples. He takes off to a deserted place. Lo and behold, the multitudes follow him, and he ends up feeding probably well over 5,000 people in total. But that's the beginning of his ministry in and around Galilee. A little more of a private ministry with his disciples. Actually, when you read the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, which is the only miracle recorded in all four Gospels, you want to think to yourself, Jesus is 1 year approximately from his crucifixion. The feeding of the 5,000 took place around Passover season. We don't know the exact date, but it took place around Passover season, and it was the Passover before his crucifixion. So when you read the feeding of the 5,000, think to yourself, okay, Jesus is 1 year from his death on a cross. Okay, so you've got in Matthew, you've got chapters 1 and 2, and first part of 3 kind of introductory material. Then you've got the early Judean ministry, followed by the great Galilean ministry, starting about chapter 4, verse 12, running all the way to about chapter 14, verse 13. All of that, those 10 chapters, are the great Galilean ministry of Christ. And then starting about chapter 14, verse 13, you've got this transition to his ministry in and around Galilee. Now, where would be the next seam in the book of Matthew? This is a little more challenging, because giving a little hint, what if Matthew skips one of the phases of Jesus' ministry? What if there's a phase of Jesus' ministry that Matthew does not record? And if you look at our chart, you'll notice that Matthew isn't one of the Gospels in which every phase is primarily recorded. But do you see anything in some of the chapters, in a later chapter, do you see anything that would suggest a transition, a seam, a change of location? So we were in chapter 14, so chapter 15, 16, 17. All of this is in and around Galilee. But do you see where there is a clear transition to somewhere outside of the area of Galilee? We're just looking for the seams in the book of Matthew. Okay. Want some help? How about 19:1? Anybody almost there? Anybody was just about ready to type in 19:1? 19:1 is your next seam. Now, if you look at chapter 19, verse 1, look at what it says. It says, "It came to pass that when Jesus had finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came into the coasts of Judea beyond Jordan." Beyond Jordan in the King James is the King James way of saying Perea. So in a harmony of the Gospels that I have, if you look in the section of that harmony on the later Judean ministry of Christ, there is nothing in that harmony in Matthew related to the later Judean phase of Jesus' ministry. Matthew just doesn't record events in that phase of Jesus' ministry. He actually goes from the time in and around Galilee, and then the next time you have the next seam is in chapter 19, verse 1. This is where we would call this the start of his later Perean ministry. Matthew might suggest some time in Judea. He says he came into the coasts of Judea beyond Jordan, and maybe a suggestion of a ministry in the area of Judea. But Matthew essentially just skips over the later Judean ministry of Christ, and he goes to the Perean. And so starting in chapter 19, verse 1 in Matthew is where you've got now the later Perean ministry of Christ, the ministry of Christ across the Jordan, again, what's called Perea. Okay, where would be the next seam? So you've got, now we're in the Perean ministry of Christ, the later Perean ministry, so chapter 19, see chapter 20. Where do we see Christ arriving in Bethany for the start of his Passion Week? Anybody say, okay, good. Okay, 21:1. If you look at 21:1, that's exactly the next scene. When they drew nigh unto Jerusalem and were come to Bethphage unto the Mount of Olives, then sent Jesus two disciples, and that really is the transition into the Passion Week of Christ. And so chapter 21 is going to start that week. You've got chapter 22, 23. This is the teaching, things taking place during that final week, and you can go all the way up to chapter 27. Really, that's brings the Passion Week to a close as we come to his crucifixion, then his burial, and really our final seam is probably 28 verse 1, which then sets the stage for the resurrection and ascension of Christ. So if you were tracing the seams in the book of Matthew, trying to look at Jesus' ministry by its different stages or phases, that's essentially what you would be. That's essentially what you would have. You would have the chapter 4, chapter 3, 13 is where you have the early Judean ministry, about a chapter, and then starting in chapter 4 all the way through chapter 14, about 10 chapters. You've got the Great Galilean Ministry. Then you've got about four chapters, 4 to 5 chapters there from chapter 14 through the end of chapter 18, which is the ministry in and around Galilee. Then you've got a couple chapters that relate to the later Perean ministry. And you've got several chapters devoted to the Passion Week. And again, the Gospels give a disproportionate amount of space to the Passion Week of our Lord. It obviously was a very significant week, the most significant week, I think we could say, in the life of our Lord. And then chapter 28, the last chapter, takes to the resurrection and the ascension. Okay, so just a little practice. Put that chart up before us again. And to see if you're awake on a Thursday evening at 8 o'clock at night, didn't want to have to think, right? Okay, let me put up what we did last week, and then we're going to build on that, and I want to do a little bit of practical work related to that tonight. Okay, so last week, this is what we talked about. We talked about parables, and we summarized the parable with these 4 statements as an illustration from everyday life. It's part of what made it so powerful. Jesus' parables depicted reality in that day. The sower sowing seed, that's what you did. A fisherman gathering fish in a net, that's what fishermen did. And so illustrations were from everyday life. They are illustrations that employ comparison. You're comparing something from everyday life with some spiritual truth. A parable is a litmus test. It hides truth from those who, without a real heart for it. You don't really have a heart for truth. Well, that's what a parable's for. It hides the truth from those who don't have a heart for it. Those who have a heart for truth, it forces them to meditate or to pray or to commune. And just as the disciples sometimes would go to Jesus and say, Lord, can you explain this parable to us? In the same way, sometimes we have to do that too. We go to the Lord and say, okay, Lord, I really want to understand this parable. Would you help me? Would you give me illumination, insight into this parable? And that's one of the purposes of a parable. And then very, very important for a parable is understanding that it's a simple fictional story that teaches one primary truth. And our goal is to get a hold of that one primary truth. And we, interpreters over the millennia or centuries of church history, have gotten themselves in trouble when they try to take a parable and turn it into an allegory and find meaning in every single detail of the parable. And they end up wandering off somewhere, and they actually lose the one primary truth of the parable. But obviously that brings up the question, if a parable has one primary point, how do you find that one main truth? And this is what we focused on last time, is we started off by reminding ourselves that just like a miracle, a parable is a type of story. And when you approach story or narrative, there are certain ways to do it. And what you're looking for is the 5 things that you have on the screen here, and there's other ways to organize this. But essentially, you go to a story, you're looking for the setting, the context, trying to identify main characters. You're looking especially at dialogue, very, very important in biblical literature. You're looking at the plot, you're trying to think through what's the problem, what's the crisis, what is the story about, and then you're looking at the conclusion, where a storyteller often puts the main truth he's trying to get across. So as we approach parables and trying to get the main point, one thing to remember is, okay, this is a kind of a story. It's different from a miracle. A miracle really happened. Parable is typically, it is a short, simple, fictional or fictitious story. So what I suggested to us last week was that I have found beneficial in trying to ferret out the main truth of a parable, to come at that parable with four questions. And essentially these are the 4 questions. The first one is, what is the setting or the context of the parable? Then what is the problem or crisis? How is that resolved? And then as you get toward the conclusion, What's the lesson that comes out of the conclusion of the parable? And these four questions are really related to the plot of a story. If you break down a story to its simplest plot elements, you can get really complicated. You break it down to its simplest elements. You essentially, in a story, you've got setting. How does the story begin? How does the story take off? What does a storyteller tell you in order to launch his story? Then you've got the action. This is where you have some problem, some crisis. That's why you have a story. If you don't have a problem, you don't have a story. So there's something that happens that launches you into the action, some kind of a crisis, some kind of a problem, something unexpected. Then you've got a resolution to that problem, and then out of that comes your conclusion. And so the four questions relate to those four parts of a story. And this is not our purpose here in our class, but what I argue is that these four questions, the answers that you get to those can ultimately become the four main points of your sermon or your teaching outline. And then you end up with your fourth point is really the main truth of the parable. That's the main theme of your lesson or your sermon. So you work through the parable in your sermon. Okay, what's the setting? How does the story begin? Okay, what's the problem? How does it resolve? How does it get resolved? What's the conclusion? And in the conclusion, you've got your main truth, and then you set before people that as the main theme, and then you apply that and illustrate that, try to ram it home with the help of the Spirit of God. So, and we talked a little bit about these different, what's involved in behind each of these different questions, some things that you're looking for in the setting or context. We talked about the problem of crisis, and I gave a number of examples of different kinds of problems and parables. Talked about the problem of the resolution of the problem. Sometimes it's resolved positively, sometimes it's resolved negatively. Sometimes you've got an unexpected twist or a turn. Parables are really good at throwing something unusual into it in the resolution, sometimes in the problem area, but sometimes in the resolution in order to bring out a certain truth. And then this question about the main truth of the parable really relates to the conclusion. How does the parable conclude? Is there any explanation given? Sometimes Jesus explains the parable. Sometimes Jesus gives the application. Sometimes the context in which the parable is set will actually suggest the application or the main truth or the main point. Sometimes Jesus will put the main truth in the mouth of one of the main characters. That actually one of the main characters will actually give the main point of the parable. But many times, again, the truth is found somewhere around the conclusion in the parable. So what I want to do tonight is I want to back out of this document, and I want to put up another document. And this is an empty document. And I tried this earlier about 6:30 before anybody else had signed in, and I got it to work. So let me see if I can do it now when everybody's watching. So I can write in this document, which is what I tried to practice earlier. So what I want to do is let's go to some of the parables, and I'm going to start in Matthew 13. And let's just work our way through as many of the parables as we have time for tonight. And I'm going to use this grid. And I have another document where I went through this for, I don't know, maybe the first, I'm not sure. Anyway, 15 or so of the parables. But I'm just going to use this chart, and I'm just going to work through some of the different parables and show you how I approach this, and I think see if this will be a help. And again, the goal is to use these story plot items, pinpointing these story plot items to help drive us toward the main lesson or the main truth or the main point of the parable. So I'm in Matthew 13. So I'm going to start off with the second parable that Jesus told in his ministry, as I understand it chronologically, and that is the parable of the sower. So how does the story begin? What topic is introduced? And I'm using the word topic a little differently, a little more literarily in the way I'm using it. So how does the story begin? And I would say that in this parable, it's something like this. A sower goes out to sow, and obviously what he's sowing is seed. So I'd say that's how the story begins, is a sower goes out to sow seed. Well, as you work through the parable, what becomes the crisis, or what's the problem? Because you assume, okay, a sower goes out to sow seed. That means he sows the seed. That means the seed grows. That means there's a harvest. That means he cashes the harvest. That means he gets money for his effort, and so on. But what you find out is that not all he sows bears a harvest. So there is seed that he scatters that there is no harvest. And you see that, for example, it falls on the wayside, and it's devoured. It falls in upon stony places, verse 5, and there is no lasting fruit. Verse 7, some falls among thorns. Thorns choke it out. So not all he sows bears a harvest, which makes you wonder, maybe if you're listening to Jesus' story, well, so is there anything that ends up bearing a harvest? Kind of sounds discouraging, and like the seed doesn't work. And then what you find is that the seed that falls on the right ground brings forth a harvest. And when you come to the end of the story, what you find out is that there's no problem with the sower, and there's no problem with the seed. The problem is with the ground. The problem is where the seed falls. When the seed falls on the right ground, it does bring forth a harvest. Now, is this chart super small? Is that better? You see that better? Okay. Okay, sorry about that. So that leads us to a lesson. What's the main lesson what can we conclude from this parable? And Jesus suggests it. He makes comments like, he who hath ears to hear, let him hear. And he goes on to talk about what you have. Some people, the disciples ask, why do you talk in parables? And then he talks about, if you have, then you'll actually be given more. What you don't have will be taken away from you. The importance of listening and hearing and understanding. And I would put it this way: cultivate the kind of heart that responds to the message of the kingdom. And I'm using the words message of the kingdom because that's essentially what Jesus uses later on when he explains it. He says, when anyone heareth the word of the kingdom and understandeth it not. And so I'm taking the seed as the word or the message of the kingdom. And so I would say that the lesson is cultivate the kind of heart that responds to the message of the kingdom. The problem is not with the message. The problem is not with those that are distributing the message. The problem is with the soil in which the message falls. And so the challenge is to be the kind of a person, or to have the right kind of a heart. And maybe from the sower's perspective, the realization that not all hearts are receptive to your message. It's not your message. It's the heart that's the problem. And that's what you're dealing with. And of course, Jesus is talking to multitudes of people when he's telling this parable. And in the multitudes of people listening to him tell this parable, there are these kinds of hearts. Not everybody hearing his words on this occasion responded to them positively. Some of those people were stony ground. Some of them were thorny ground. Some of them were like the seed on the wayside. But then you had some that was good ground. Okay, let's move on. So you've got another parable later on in this same chapter, Matthew chapter 13. And this begins in verse 24. And so I'm going to say, how does the story begin? What's the topic introduced? I'm going to put it this way, that a man sows good seed in his field, but his enemy then sows bad seed. So I'm gonna put all that as how the story begins. Is a man sows good seed in his field, but his enemy then sows bad seed. And then that leads to a crisis or a problem, and that is that weeds appear alongside the wheat. And of course, now the issue is, should the weeds be pulled up immediately? And that's the question that some of the man's servants have. Sir, verse 27, didst thou not sow good seed in thy field, and so on. So the servants say, verse 28, wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? So this is your crisis or problem. Should you go ahead and immediately pull up the weeds? And of course, we know the answer because of our familiarity with these. That leaving the resolution is to leave the sorting until the time of harvest, when the difference between the two will be clear. And so that's the resolution in this story is, okay, let's not pull it up now. Let's just wait, and we'll pull it up later. Okay, well, what's the lesson to learn from this parable? Well, again, like the parable of the sower, Jesus actually explains this parable. And this is valuable because I think without this, we would actually we might miss it. We might not understand this parable fully, because actually the seed sown in this parable is not the word of the kingdom. The seed is actually the good seed. The wheat is actually the sons of the kingdom, and the weeds are actually the sons of the evil one. So actually here it's not the message, it's the people who receive the message or don't receive the message. And so what you end up with as far as the lesson of this parable, you come down as Jesus explains it, verse 40. He's working through the explanation. The tares are gathered, burned in the fire. So shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels. They shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity. Shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. And so I put this as a lesson that Jesus is drawing. It's something like that. That maybe sometimes in our day and time, it's not always clear who is who or which is which. I think we've all experienced that in our various ministries. You have people that you kind of think are in, and then maybe you find out later, well, maybe they're not after all. And so it's not always 100% clear now who's in and who's out. But it will be. There will be no mistaking who is a son of the kingdom and who is not a son of the kingdom in the future, at the end of the world, as Jesus puts it. So that's the lesson. That's a takeaway lesson from this parable. Okay, let's move to another parable. Again, I'm just working through these rather quickly because I think we're very familiar with these. Let's show how this works. And this method has really helped me, even some where I don't have an answer right away in terms of putting it in the grid. But meditating on the parable actually has helped me kind of pull out the main point. So, for example, the next parable that Jesus told was the parable of the mustard seed. This is in verse 31. And so I would say, what is the topic? How does it begin? What's the topic? Well, I would say the topic is something like this. A man plants a mustard seed in his field. And crisis problem. Well, again, this is where it's a little different. It's not like there's a explicit problem or crisis. So, but what is going to be unusual about this? What is it that in the parable that will be resolved, so to speak? And I would put it something like this for this kind of a parable, that the crisis or problem is that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds. So that's what here you're going to plant a mustard seed, but the thing is the seed is so incredibly small. So is it really significant? Is it going to make a difference? Well, what you find in the parable is that when you sow this seed, which is the least of all the seeds, what happens is that when it is grown, it becomes a tree. I'm going to put tree in quotation marks because it may not be officially classified as a tree, but it looks like a tree. And that's really the point that Jesus is making, is here's this little tiny seed, It's a seed of a kind of a plant, a vegetable plant, or a garden plant. But when it actually grows up, it actually resembles an actual tree, and it's taller than other plants. So that's the resolution of this, so to speak. So what kind of a lesson, what is Christ trying to pull out as a lesson from this? And you can state this in different ways. I would say here's one way: don't underestimate the power or importance of the kingdom because of its seeming insignificance. Jesus is likening this to the kingdom of heaven, so that's why I'm trying to put the word kingdom in there. Somebody said something like this: something insignificant can make an impact way out of proportion to its size. And one of the dangers would be that somebody would look at the kingdom of heaven. They would look, for example, at the ministry of Christ. They would look at the smallness or the lack of grandeur, and they would think, this is insignificant, this is not important. And the point of the parable is, don't judge it by what it looks like. It may look insignificant, but it's going to deliver an impact way out of proportion to its size. And this would be similar to the next parable, which is in verse 32, where you have a woman who mixes yeast into 21 kilos of flour. And I think what helps you understand this parable is to understand the amount of flour that you're talking about. The parable mentions 3 measures, and a measure is a Greek measurement, and it's one measure is about 7 kilos. And so you're looking at 21 kilos of flour, which is roughly enough to cook bread for 100 people. So what's your problem or crisis that let's say that this woman is facing? I would put it something like this: that's a lot of flour to leaven or infuse. So that's 21 kilos of flour. I'm not sure anybody have in their kitchen right now 21 kilos of flour. That is a lot of flour. And so you're going to put some leaven in that, and you really expect that if you put leaven in that, it's going to actually diffuse into all of that flour. And what happens in the resolution is all the flour is leavened. And so I would say again, and I think these 2 parables are intended to go together, that it's teaching the same basic principle as the previous parable. The idea of something, don't underestimate something that is small or seemingly insignificant. Okay, next parable that Jesus told was about a man who is hunting for treasure. And this is in verse 44. And he likens the kingdom of heaven to a treasure that's hid in a field, which a man finds, which when a man hath found, he hideth, and for joy thereof goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. Okay, well, what's that about? What kind of a topic is being introduced? And I would put it something like this: a man finds a treasure in a field, and in my notes I added this, and reburies it. So a man finds a treasure in a field, and he sees the treasure, he wants the treasure, he likes the treasure, he reburies the treasure to keep it from being found by others. But what's the problem? Anybody guess what the problem is? The problem is what? The field what? The field does not belong to him. And I would say an additional problem that's suggested later on in the parable is that to buy the field will cost him everything he owns. That's the problem. He finds this incredible treasure that he really wants. He reburies it to keep it from anybody else. But the crisis, okay, it's in a field that doesn't own to him. And to buy that field is going to cost him everything he owns. So what do you think? Is it worth it? Is it worth it to sell everything you have in order to buy one field? Well, it depends on the treasure in that field. So the resolution, what happens in the resolution is he joyfully sells everything he has and buys the field. So he decides that the treasure in the field is worth giving up everything that he owns. And so he buys the field for the sake of the treasure in the field. So what's the lesson? What's the main point? Well, I put it this way in my notes. The kingdom of heaven is a treasure worth sacrificing everything you have in order to possess it. Somebody put it this way. This is from Carson, the supreme worth of the kingdom. The supreme worth of the kingdom. And so it is not teaching a work salvation. What it is teaching is the value of the kingdom. If we realized how valuable the kingdom is, we would understand that it is worth sacrificing everything we have in order to possess it. And to put a face on this, I think you could say that people that have given their life investing in this life and have gone into eternity without Christ and who are now in a place of torment, they would say a hearty amen to this. They would say, it being a part of the kingdom is worth everything. So that's a lesson that parable is teaching. Okay, let me go to some of the chats here, see if I can answer some of the chats here. Okay, so we got a first question here. I would say yes, the yeast is a small quantity as compared to the flour. That's the idea behind the yeast, is you put a rather insignificant amount of yeast in the flour, and it somehow manages to permeate the whole batch of flour. Okay, so here's a question about the yeast in the Old Testament. Yeast equaling sin. Okay, the idea of yeast being sin, I'm not sure if that's as much an Old Testament thing as an idea you get from the New Testament a little more clearly, that a little leaven leavens a whole lump, for example. And one of the reasons unleavened bread in the Old Testament was a requirement was that it goes back to the Exodus, when the Israelites had to leave so quickly that there was not time for their bread to rise. There was not time for the bread to leaven, and so they ended up leaving with unleavened bread. And that's the fact that led to the emphasis on unleavened bread. And it becomes a parallel then in the New Testament. But I think the focus, I would say leaven, rather than seeing leaven as equal to sin, I would say leaven is equal to something that influences. That's the way I would view it. Whether it's sin or whether it's something else, leaven is a powerful influence that renders an impact far beyond its size. So I would say to take the idea of the leaven as an idea of sin. Remember that a woman hiding leaven in flour is likened to the kingdom of heaven. I'm typing this in, that's why it's taking me a minute here. So it's likened to the kingdom of heaven. So I to get the main point of the parable, I think you've got to say, okay, so something about this is like the kingdom of heaven. It's not likening it to sin in this case. And I think that's where, and there's another question here about how birds represent evil. And what happens is sometimes we get a hold of symbols and we think that symbol always means the same thing. And it doesn't always mean the same thing. So you've got to go with the context And I would say regarding the parable of the mustard seed and the birds and so on, I think that's where you, again, it's like we said earlier, a parable, I'm going to type this in here, a parable has one main point. And you want to focus on that one main point. And I think if you take, if you look again at verse 31, I think, and verse 31 and 32, I think if you focus on this as, okay, the idea is you've got things that are evil that are in the kingdom, I think you lose the point of the parable. Because the point of the parable is that a very small seed ends up in quite a large plant in proportion to its seed that even could be called a tree, and it's of such size that even birds come and lodge in it. And it's not being said as a negative thing. It's being said as the power of that seed. The result of this little tiny seed is something that is way out of proportion to its size. And then if you take that in connection with verse 33, again, you've got it re-emphasized, and I think that also verifies our interpretation. So I don't, personally, I would not go down the road of trying to identify the trees, the birds as something evil. I'm not sure you're going to end up on the right. I'm not sure they're going to end up right if you do that. So again, that's where a parable has one main point, and sometimes the details have significance, like when Jesus would explain the parable. So we know that, like, okay, the seed is the message of the kingdom, and here's the thorny ground. So we know that there were that they signified things, but I think you want to be careful that in the process, in other words, I guess what I'm saying is this: don't prioritize Bible-wide symbolism over the context of the parable, because a symbol is not necessarily always, it can symbolize different things. It doesn't always symbolize one thing. I think leaven is a good example of that, and some other things as well. So that's where I would be careful. Okay, so we've got a question here, like a parable. How do we know a parable is a parable, like Lazarus and the rich man? Well, if you pull off a half a dozen commentaries on the book of Luke, and you look at the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, you're actually going to come up with divided opinions. You're going to have some that take it as a parable. You're going to have some that take it as a real story. And there's some division, and there's fancy terms that they'll apply even to it. So it could be a parable. It might not be a parable. Many people have felt that it's not a parable because it uses proper names. If it is a parable, it would be the only parable that Jesus told that uses proper names. To counter that would be to make the observation that Lazarus was the third most common name in the New Testament period of time. And so to use the name Lazarus is like, I don't know what you would say in Singapore, but in America we might say John Smith. It's a very common name, and sometimes you'll use John or Betty as examples and illustrations because that's a name that is so common. So some people have argued very strongly that it's not a parable, and I think a main reason why that they argue that is because if it is a parable, then their concern is that you lose truth. Because here's a story about a rich man in hell, and if it's a parable, then it's a fictitious story, and then you don't have a rich man in hell, and then you lose a very important passage on hell. to counter that, I would say this, that I would say that, let's just say, for argument, let's say that it is a parable. Do we lose truth? Because when Jesus told parables, the power of parables are that they depict real situations. They're not science fiction. They depict real situations. Like, here's what I mean. For example, a man planting a mustard seed. That is a real situation. That's a kind of a thing that people would do. You have, for example, a man traveling on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. That is a real life situation. In other words, when Jesus told a parable, he used an everyday illustration from real life. So I would say if it is a parable, then the parable has an assumed reality to it, just like Jesus' other parables. In other words, he's telling a parable about something that is reality, and the reality is that you have a place like Abraham's bosom, and you have a place like Hades, and it's a place of torment. Hades is, and there's no escape from that place, and people in Abraham's bosom don't come back to share the gospel. So there's an assumed there's an assumed reality in his parables, that if it is a parable, it would be true of this parable as well. And it doesn't have to be called a parable to be a parable. There are parables that are not introduced as a parable. And in fact, you have some things that are introduced as a parable that we might call a proverb. As we talked about last week, the word proverb is actually the word parable is a broader word that includes parables, illustrations, comparisons, and what we call parables. So you have parables that are not called parables. So anyway, there's discussion either way on that. I'll let you work through to your own conclusion. Some people to get out of the squeeze, just say the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and that would be true on anybody's account. The story of the rich man and Lazarus, and but I would say either way you go, I don't think you lose truth. It still has an assumed reality, and if it's a real story, then you've got a real man, a real rich man who is in Hades. So I hope that answers some of these very good questions. Any other questions like that? I mean, I can just keep going here on just trying to show us as we work through these parables how to isolate the different parts of the parable and allow that to lead us to the main point. So like the next parable we come to is this pearl, and this is a very similar one, to this pearl hunting merchant that finds an incredibly valuable pearl. And of course the problem or crisis again is to buy the pearl will cost him everything he has. So that's do I go for this pearl? If I do, it's going to cost me everything I have. Well, as we know, he sells everything he has and he buys the pearl. And I would say, again, my theme is very similar to what I had here. I would say the kingdom of heaven, and I changed it a little bit here, but the kingdom of heaven is so valuable that it is worth sacrificing everything you have or to possess it. Do you can you think of a verse, another verse that teaches the same truth? Like when I think of these two parables, I think of the verse where Jesus says, "What does it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" And the idea of a comparison between owning everything and losing your soul for all eternity. And the comparative value of that, the soul, is so much more valuable. Okay, we're out of time. We could just keep going. But anyway, that's what I would suggest in terms of thinking through parables. And some of the parables are a little more challenging than others, but I think this is a way to work through it and try to get to the main points. I hope that's helpful somewhat. Any final questions here as we end up for tonight? Okay, let's see here. You mean like this sheet we're working on here? Sure. Sure can. I'll work on getting it in a format that I can save it.
All right. Jacob has asked me to end this session. So any quick question from anybody? If not, then once again, Dr. Tim Berrey, thank you very much for this evening's session. I think it's very insightful, very interesting. Certainly, I learned more about interpreting parables, and I'm sure all my fellow JSMers learn as well. Thank you very much, and we'll hope to learn from you again next week.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and good night to all of you as well.
Good night.